Hello everyone, hopefully my recorder has actually started, and welcome back to another exciting week of online American History 2. As you can see, we are now back to our regular broadcasting schedule, or publication schedule, or whatever you want to call it. I've never viewed lectures on YouTube before myself, so I'm not sure what to call this. But anyway, as you can see here, we are going to be, of course, primarily covering the Vietnam War today, continuing our focus on the Cold War. We're also going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis a little bit because it is hugely important, but quite frankly, I wasn't exactly sure where else to fit it in. So since it was going on around the same time as the Vietnam War, we're going to throw that in today as well. Now, as always, we will of course start off by looking at some key terms. We are of course going to be looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis. We'll do that first. We're also going to look at something in the Vietnam War called the My Lai Massacre. We're going to look back home and talk about something called the Kent State Shooting. We're going to look at Operation Rolling Thunder. We're going to look at the Tet Offensive. And we're going to look at the Cambodia bombings, all of which took place in the Vietnam War. Now, you will notice I do have a lot packed into today, but it is because, quite frankly, I think Vietnam is one of the most important conflicts from an American perspective in the entire Cold War, and as we'll talk about next in the next lesson, has done a lot to sort of view how we view America in the world and how we view American conflict and America's military history. But again, we'll get into that a little bit more next week. Today, I just want to go over quite thoroughly, as much as I can, details of the Vietnam War. But again, in the meantime, I do just, of course, want to let you know about your important upcoming dates. You do have a third writing assignment coming up. That is on November the 13th at 5 p.m. As I have stressed several times, so you should all know about this by now, the prompt and the rubric for this assignment have already been on Moodle and are still currently on Moodle. So whenever you view this, you should have already been able to go on there and go ahead and start getting prepared for this assignment. Your fourth content quiz will pop up next week on November the 20th. That'll, of course, also be due at 5 p.m. And we're going to have our third debate sometime during the week or the week before of November 30th at 5 p.m. When I made this, I had not put up the Google Sheet for you guys to sign up for the debate times, but I have done that as of now. You should have gotten my email that is already up there. So all you got to do is go to the Debate 3 section of Moodle. You can sign up for your times and go ahead and pick a team. Please do that as soon as possible, because this one is going to be a little bit more tricky even than the others, because this is during the week or after the week of Thanksgiving. So of course I couldn't schedule as many days as I would like to as a possibility, because I really don't want to take away from your Thanksgiving break. So go ahead and start signing up for these as soon as possible, so we can get those dates hashed out. Or whatever the term is the old people who are even older than me used to use. But anyway, like I said, I do want to talk a little bit about the Cold War, of course. So we are going to look at the Cold War very briefly in Cuba to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, this is, of course, oversimplifying it, so I recommend you take a World Civilizations class or a Cold War class at some point to delve into this in more detail. But big picture, on January 1st, 1951, Fidel Castro led a guerrilla army to overthrow the U.S.-backed government in the area. You'll remember a few weeks ago we talked about the Spanish-American War and how America essentially set themselves up as the imperial powers, but not really in Cuba through the Platt Amendments. In 1951, Fidel Castro and others were tired of that system. They decided to overthrow this new government. Now, interestingly, something a lot of people don't know about Castro is that he was not always a Marxist or always a communist. He was originally just a Cuban nationalist who had no real specific economic agenda other than just making sure the United States didn't keep the majority of the profits Cuba was making. So, for example, he mainly wanted to limit foreign investment and property holding in the country. Instead of having these foreign powers own stuff, he wanted the Cubans to own stuff. This is again primarily being done by the Americans and also some remnant of the Spanish who still own portions of the island. He allied with the USSR in 1960 in order to gain access to Soviet aid and oil, but still was not officially a communist. This changed in December of 1961 during the Bay of Pigs invasion. Essentially, in a nutshell, which actually if you want a pretty good summary of this, I would recommend the Netflix film The Irishman. But anyway, Kennedy and the CIA supported a bunch of a dissident army, so essentially Cuban exiles, who had come in to try to overthrow Castro. This invasion was, of course, famously unsuccessful, and afterwards, Castro officially did declare himself a Marxist-Leninist. Now, why do you think he would do this? Our first awkward pause of the day. Which, by the way, in case you're wondering, these pictures over here, this is a picture of some of the Cuban exiles, so people who did not support or were enemies of Castro's regime. This is Castro celebrating the Bay of Pigs victory. Yeah, essentially, as you might imagine, some historians have argued that this is almost an enemy of my enemy is my friend scenario. Many people would argue that Castro wasn't necessarily going to be actively opposed to the United States after his revolution was successful, but once the United States took an active effort to overthrowing him, he decided to ally with their enemies in order to defend Cuba. Now, this doesn't, of course, necessarily excuse everything that Castro did, but it is important to recognize that the United States' foreign involvement had consequences just as much as the Soviet Union's did, which of course we will talk about that a little bit more as well. Now, Cuban Missile Crisis in a nutshell. On May 1962, the Soviet Union decided they were going to place intermediate ballistic missiles in Cuba. This was an attempt to counter the lack of ICBMs they had, intercontinental ballistic missiles, in comparison to America. They had 4, we had about an estimated 171. Intercontinental ballistic missiles, in case you didn't know, are missiles that are, as you can might guess from the name, capable of firing across continents. So of course it makes sense the Soviet Union would want to try to even up this balance somehow and get better missile access to the United States. By October the 14th through the 15th, the Americans had started to spot these Soviet installations and missiles and all the supply trucks going into Cuba, which you can see some of their areas here. On October the 16th, Kennedy officially placed a naval quarantine, not a blockade, around Cuba to try to buy time for negotiations. Now, this led to October the 22nd, which is when Kennedy gave one of his most famous speeches he ever gave about alerting the public about this Cuban Missile Crisis. Essentially, he promised the public he would prevent the missiles from reaching Cuba and called upon the Soviet Union to withdraw. What I'd like you to do is follow this link right here when you're at some point when you're viewing this and look over this speech and answer these questions. Why did Kennedy mention where he got the authority to make his decision? Why does that matter? Why did he call the naval action a quarantine and not a blockade? Because again, I even specified for you up here, this was a quarantine. He did not officially call it a blockade. Why does that difference matter? And again, why was Kennedy's decision to view any missile attack on the United States as a declaration of war so dangerous? Look at things about what we've discussed with the Cold War so far. What's going to happen next if the Soviet Union does do a missile attack? This led to an exchange of letters between Kennedy and Khrushchev, who was the premier of the Soviet Union at the time, where from October the 23rd to the 24th, where they just sent a series of letters back and forth, threatening each other, lying to each other, and essentially almost seeming to instigate war to threaten each other. Now, the crisis did seem to get worse at first after this point. For example, on October the 25th, a Soviet oil tanker named Bucharest, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, was approaching Cuba. Kennedy made the controversial decision to let it pass instead of trying to halt the tanker. Now again, why do you think he did this, and is this a risky decision? Alright, yes, this one's fairly obvious. He made the decision, of course, in order to maybe avoid a war. If he starts actively taking steps to stop Soviet ships, they might retaliate. We're going to get that mutually assured destruction we've mentioned several times in this class. This, however, is of course risky, because maybe on the one hand you're going to allow the Soviets to supply their missile installations and military presence, making them more dangerous, and it also, to some, sent a message of weakness to the rest of the world and to the American people, making it seem like Kennedy was just going to roll over in order to avoid a conflict. So again, on the one hand, Kennedy's essentially in a really tough place. On the one hand, he has to try to appear strong, but if he acts too strongly, he might start a war. So you can see here, people are calling for him to be careful, arguing for him to get peace or they're all going to perish. So again, no real easy decision for anyone at this point. On October the 26th, interestingly, Castro sent a letter to Khrushchev asking him to be willing to launch missiles into America and, in his words, eliminate this danger forever in an act of the most legitimate self-defense. Khrushchev actually responded to this letter by going to Kennedy and trying to get them to work together to solve the crisis. This, of course, as you might guess, is one of the reasons Castro has such a negative reputation in the United States. Shows that and you'll see this as we go throughout the rest of this semester, by the way. The Cubans were typically even more aggressive under Castro in combating capitalism and United States influence than the Soviet Union was. Castro was oftentimes willing to go the extra mile, I suppose you could say, in comparison to what the Soviets were willing to do. The crisis seemed to get to its worst point by the 27th, when U.S. pilot Major Rudolph Anderson was shot down over Cuba. Perhaps even more than this incident scaring people was the response. The United States Assistant Secretary of Defense at the time said that they have fired the first shot, and Kennedy responded with, "We are now in an entirely new ball game." Now again, why is this going to scare people especially? Alright, as this again is very similar to still foreign policy issues today occasionally. It seems like, especially with this first quote from the Secretary of Defense, that the United States is essentially trying to justify military action. So it's like, since this has now happened, we have the right to retaliate, so people won't blame them if a conflict does escalate. So this would help convince people, especially people who are aware of more decision making, that a conflict is likely to happen. However, between October the 27th and the 28th, and partially in response to this incident, Kennedy actually agreed to withdraw nuclear missiles the United States had in Turkey if Khrushchev agreed to withdraw missiles from Cuba. This agreement was accepted by the Soviets, and the crisis was now declared to be over. So, just to sort of summarize, why do you think both leaders changed their stances so abruptly on this? And is the White House correct, as they claimed, when they said that the crisis was solved by Kennedy's tough stance? How exactly maybe should we respond to this conflict today? Possibly could have worded that better, but it's almost to the end of the semester. Hopefully you all cut me some slack. Man, keep that in mind. This is one of the best examples of sort of the fears of mutually assured destruction that ever occurred in the Cold War, which of course could be a big idea of why their stances changed so abruptly. Once the crisis started to escalate and it looked like there really could be conflict, and people on both sides were calling for this conflict to occur even, people, and mostly a lot of the rational leaders potentially, are going to back down and try to avoid us all nuking each other, essentially. But anyway, that leads us into the Vietnam War. What I'd like you to do now, if you have a chance, is to watch filmmaker Ken Burns talk about the legacy of the Vietnam War. Because as I said, the Vietnam War is one of the more troubling and controversial aspects of American history, and its influence is still pretty hotly debated today. So that's something I want to discuss a little bit as we get into this lesson. So, according to Ken Burns, think about when you watch this video, according to Ken Burns, what exactly does separate the Vietnam War from other major American wars? And interesting also, why do you think history has often treated the Vietnam War as a footnote? Because again, while you hear a lot of people talk about respecting Vietnam veterans and things of that nature, you usually don't typically hear very much about the Vietnam War itself. Why might that be the case? But anyway, in the meantime, let's go ahead and go to the prelude of the war in Vietnam, because as you probably know by now, I love giving historical context. It's kind of what I do. In 1884, France actually claimed Vietnam as a colony. So before the United States ever even got involved, the French had already colonized Vietnam. By 1921, a rebel leader named Ho Chi Minh had created the Viet Minh, which was a nationalist independence party. Essentially, they wanted to get rid of the French. By World War II, Vietnam had become a co-French and Japanese colony, with their policies being so terrible combined that an estimated 2 million starved while France and the Japanese were jointly controlling Vietnam. Which, by the way, can anyone tell me why the Japanese would all of a sudden be co-ruling the colony now? What happened there? Sorry if you can hear my dog barking, by the way. She just loves to do that. But yes, if you remember, the French, of course, surrendered to the Nazis and the Axis powers during World War II. As a result of that, due to the Japanese alliance with the Nazis, they were given control of Vietnam as a reward for their alliance. Now, as you might expect, the United States supported Ho Chi Minh in his conflict against the Japanese. They would send in advisors, send in supplies when they could, things like that, to help the Vietnamese fight the Japanese. Naturally, again, enemy of my enemy is my friend. However, after the war was over, the United States later supported France in their attempt to reclaim control of Vietnam after the Japanese had been kicked out. Now, why do you think they would do this? Remember, what's going on in the world after World War II ends? All right, yes, very good. Once again, remember, after the United States doesn't really want to risk alienating or upsetting the French when we have this Cold War kicking off against the Soviet Union and the communist world. If the United States alienates the French, you have one less ally in the Western world to help halt the advance of communism. So essentially, because of this international situation, the United States abandoned Ho Chi Minh and his allies to support the French. As you might imagine, Ho Chi Minh did not take this very well. Despite the United States' help for the French in trying to reclaim Vietnam, from September 1945 to May 7th of 1954, France and Vietnam conducted the First Indochina War. As a result of this war, the French eventually did split up or abandon Vietnam and split the country into their northern and southern halves. I love that dog when she barks. It does make it hard to concentrate. But again, as many of you probably know, Ho Chi Minh and the communists would end up getting control of the north as a result of this war, and a man named Ngo Dinh Diem, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, got control of the south. Again, as you can imagine, the United States didn't take this very well either, and did get heavily involved in northern and southern Vietnam to try to protect capitalist South Vietnam. Now, this of course led to the Vietnam War, which you might see here, which is a bit surprising. I am going to go through the actual battles and military aspects of the war very quickly. That's mainly because that's probably what most of you who are familiar with the Vietnam War are familiar with. And since this is a survey course, I think it's more important to talk to you guys about the legacy and impact of this war, more than just the sort of day-to-day minutia of every single battle. Not saying that's not important either, but in a survey class, I have to give you more of a big picture thing. But anyway, from about 1961 to 1964, the United States just sent technical, military, and financial aid to Vietnam. They didn't get directly involved. There were really no boots on the ground. Now, this hopefully reminds you a little bit of the Korean War, for example. Why might we be so reluctant to wage war directly and just want to send aid instead? Once again, very good. Class is hopefully watching this at home. I hadn't made any jokes about that yet, I realized. Again, this is an example of how limited Cold War conflicts typically had to be. If we started waging war directly in Vietnam, it could bring in some of the larger communist and communist Soviet powers and lead to a broader conflict which might eventually get to nuclear warfare. For example, as you'll see here, Vietnam is of course very, very close to China. If you get too involved, China might get involved. Excuse me. This will eventually help lead to actually Operation Rolling Thunder, which was an attempt to have bombing raids on the supply line called Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was limited by the proximity of the trail to China. So again, this is part of the reason why the Vietnam War dragged out so long. We could never really get fully engaged in the conflict or do all the damage we wanted to do, because you don't really want to risk taking off China at this point. A couple other battles that were significant. You have the Ai Drong battle, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, where airborne troops are dropped into a valley and ambushed with roughly 300 casualties. This is typical of Vietnam conflict, by the way. Due to the dense jungle, you couldn't really have large standing armies and large active conflicts. It was more of dropping in smaller numbers of warriors, having conflicts with the guerrilla fighters of North Vietnam. The Battle of Lang Vay was a very destructive battle as well. The North Vietnamese used Russian tanks to attack a Green Beret outpost and killed approximately half of the soldiers there. Finally, also, there is one of the most well-known and controversial aspects of the war, the Tet Offensive, which, by the way, for those of you who've seen Full Metal Jacket, that's actually the conflict that is depicted throughout parts of Full Metal Jacket. Very great movie, highly disturbing though, so I don't recommend it to the faint of heart. But essentially, the Viet Cong, who are the North Vietnamese guerrilla troops, attacked the U.S. Embassy in Saigon and various other government installations in South Vietnam. Now, why might this be so significant to the war? Why did so many people hear about this, for example? It even got a movie made about it. All right, as you might guess, again, this seemed to demonstrate to people the limited effect the United States was able to have in the Vietnam War. Because on the one hand, not only are we able to really wage full war as we might like to, but this seemed to show people that the United States couldn't even protect their own government buildings within South Vietnam, let alone North Vietnam. This seemed to show a failure to protect themselves in South Vietnam. Things escalated with the Cambodia bombings when Nixon, who was president by this point, decided to bomb Cambodia throughout the 1970s to hurt those same supply lines. So, whereas earlier, Operation Rolling Thunder wasn't really willing to get into China or other countries, Nixon was willing to bomb other countries as well. This, of course, could cause the conflict to escalate and draw more people in. Finally, by 1975, March 29th specifically, the United States was convinced that due to these factors and the limited conflict they were able to wage, Vietnam was unwinnable. So the last US troops were pulled out of Vietnam by March 29th, and Saigon fell to northern Vietnamese troops by April 30th of that same year. So barely a month later. Now, again, that'll get us a little bit into the lasting impacts of some of the more controversial parts of the Vietnam War. There are several problems with the Vietnam War that make it stand out in comparison to some other wars we've been involved in. For one, you had intense corruption within both governments. Diem, who we supported in the South due to his capitalist pro-US leanings, for example, Tibbet was highly active in persecuting Buddhists. He would lock up various peasants in his forts, he would practice nepotism, he practiced rigged elections, and he had secret police across the country. For this, the persecution of Buddhists in particular led to some of the most striking protests I can ever think of in world history, essentially. Many Buddhists would go out into the streets in full view of everyone in broad daylight and light themselves on fire with gasoline in protest to Diem's various policies. This, for example, is the first known as the first instance of this protest in 1963, when this individual, who I won't disrespect by trying to pronounce his name, again did burn himself in the public to protest the government's policies against Buddhists. So again, very controversial figure who many Americans and many international people didn't like that the US was supporting. Ho Chi Minh, however, was really no better, if not worse. He practiced a policy called purification, particularly after the United States withdrew from Vietnam. There were potentially 13,500 plus executions. It's of course a bit difficult to estimate because North Vietnam wasn't exactly forthcoming with information. He participated in political suppression, and mass graves were discovered throughout the country, throughout North Vietnam after the Tet Offensive. Again, this again is another video that's not for the faint of heart, but just to give you an idea of how striking this protest was and what the world must have felt, well, how people must have reacted during this time. I have linked a YouTube video where you can see this Buddhist monk performing this first protest. Again, this is not a required viewing. This one's not for the faint of heart. But anyway, in the meantime, from the American side especially, the war, besides just our support of Diem, was extremely unpopular. For example, the My Lai massacre was a very highly publicized massacre conducted by U.S. troops on Vietnamese citizens, with approximately 150 to 500 plus body count. One account, a couple I have below, if I can ever learn to talk, I have a few accounts of some survivors or participants in the massacre. One said, I saw them shoot an M79 grenade launcher into a group of people who were still alive. But it was mostly done with a machine gun. They were shooting women and children just like anybody else. This is from Sergeant Michael Bernhardt, a soldier at the scene. Another said, we met no resistance and I only saw 3 captured weapons. We had no casualties. It was just like any other Vietnamese village, old papasans, men, women, and kids. As a matter of fact, I don't remember seeing one military-age male in the entire place, dead or alive. We kept flying back and forth, and it didn't take very long until we started noticing a large number of bodies everywhere. Everywhere we'd look, we'd see bodies. There were infants, 2, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, women, very old men, no draft-age people whatsoever. This was stated by a soldier named Thompson at a My Lai conference in 1994. So as you can imagine, news of massacres like this, which were conducted by U.S. soldiers on multiple occasions, made the war very unpopular as well. One other interesting aspect of the war that I think is a bit unique is the reporter access. Seasoned reporters from seasoned reporters to high school newspapers, pretty much anyone who wanted to was able to get complete access to reporting the Vietnam War. This is part of the reason that massacres like this were so widely known. To give you an example of this, I found some ABC News footage from 1969 to demonstrate the kind of reporting the American public could see during the Vietnam War. So again, as you watch this, think about how footage like this is going to affect the opinion of the war. How are people going to react to seeing the gritty reality of things like this? One of the more problematic aspects at home of the Vietnam War was the Kent State Massacre, which occurred on May 4th, 1970. National Guardsmen fired live rounds at student protesters on campus, killing 4 and wounding about 11. In 1968, the Chicago protest occurred when 26,000 troops and National Guardsmen and police beat and tear-gassed protesters during the Democratic National Convention. So again, very unpopular war leading to a lot of violence both in Vietnam and back home. Now, to give you a little bit more idea of what the Kent State shooting was like, because again, this is an American history course, we do want to look at America a little bit. On April 30th, 1970, as I mentioned earlier, President Nixon ordered invasions and bombings of neutral Cambodia in order to attack the North Vietnamese sheltering there. This again led to a lot of widespread protests because people thought he was broadening the war. By May 1st, several Kent State students had gathered in the hundreds to protest Nixon's decision. Violence broke out between the protesters and the police, which eventually led to the closure of all the bars across the city. By May 2nd, National Guard had been sent in after there were rumored threats against local businesses by the protesters. The protesters were believed to later have set fire to the school's ROTC building. By May 4th, National Guard General Robert Canterbury had ordered an estimated crowd of 3,000 protesters to disperse. They responded by throwing rocks and insults, and the National Guard eventually responded by launching tear gas on the crowd, as you can see here, and by eventually firing live ammunition. Now, this question is, as you might imagine, actually even more relevant than it was when I eventually made this lesson about a year ago. Who exactly is in the wrong in this incident? As you might imagine, that is a bit relevant because it seems fairly similar to what's been going on this past year with Black Lives Matter protests and various other demonstrations. So again, maybe to give us another idea of how we deal with the issues now, who exactly is in the wrong in this scenario? Do you blame the protesters? Do you blame the National Guard? What exactly went wrong here? And again, to get a little bit more direct and specific, how is this going to affect the outlook on the war? I won't tell you too much on how to think about who is in the wrong in this incident. Again, I do support the free speech and protest, of course, but again, is it entirely the protesters' fault or entirely National Guard's fault? That, again, except for making my free speech comment, which might have gave myself away a little bit, I'll leave that up to you. But in the meantime, how is this going to affect the outlook of the war? As you might imagine, seeing dead college students on the side of the road is probably not going to get people very excited about the war effort. Now, many of you are probably also familiar with the veterans struggle and the unique experience of Vietnamese war veterans. These veterans have many unique issues, which we can still see being carrying out in various effects today. For example, prisoners of war were notoriously treated very brutally in this war. They would be frequently marched and beaten throughout North Vietnamese cities, locked in concrete boxes, and frequently tortured. For example, you can see a young John McCain here, who was famously a prisoner of war in the Vietnam War. He gave an account later stating, "To get back to the story, they took me out of my room to Slopehead, who said, 'You have violated all the camp regulations. You're a black criminal. You must confess your crimes.' I said that I wouldn't do that, and he asked, 'Why are you so disrespectful of guards?' I answered, 'Because the guards treat me like an animal.' When I said that, the guards, who were all in the room, about 10 of them, really laid into me. They bounced me from pillar to post, kicking and laughing and scratching. After a few hours of that, ropes were put on me and I sat that night bound with ropes. Then I was taken to a small room. For punishment, they would always take you to another room where you didn't have a mosquito net, or a bed, or any clothes. For the next 4 days, I was beaten every 2 or 3 hours by different guards. My left arm was broken again and my ribs were crushed.' So again, not only is war just bad enough by itself, if you were unlucky enough to be taken prisoner, you were often subjected to horrible treatment. However, more uniformly, there was widespread psychological and physical trauma connected to the Vietnam War. For example, during World War II and in the aftermath of World War II, military studies were done which showed that only about 15% of soldiers fired their weapons in battle, so the military commanders altered basic training to encourage soldiers to kill and to even encourage them to enjoy killing and defeating the enemy. As you might imagine, some psychologists and historians have argued that this led to psychological effects. For example, 30% of the men involved in the Vietnam War and 27% of the women in the war have reported PTSD symptoms or some kind of related symptoms. For example, these can include depression, drug use, and nightmares, and they've all been reported at some point in their life. There were about 200 reported instances of fragging, which is a military slang for killing your officer, during the war, much higher than was reported throughout all of World War II. Agent Orange, of course, still has many medical effects, which those of you who have family members who were in the Vietnam War unfortunately might already be aware of. Agent Orange was essentially a chemical that was dropped over the jungles of Vietnam to eliminate the tree cover that the Vietnamese soldiers would use to hide themselves. It is estimated by the Red Cross that 3 million Vietnamese and 2.8 million American veterans were affected by the dropping of Agent Orange, various forms like cancer and other medical diseases in response to this chemical. Now, overall impacts of the war. The casualties included about 58,220 U.S. deaths. There are about 2 million Vietnamese deaths, 3 million Vietnamese wounded, and about 12 million Vietnamese refugees. The economic impact was substantial as well. There was about 120 billion spent throughout the course of the war, and this helped lead to widespread inflation, which was made worse by the 1973 oil crisis, which we will also get to, by the way. Finally, let's talk again about the psychological impact that Ken Burns mentioned a little bit. How exactly did this war change America's perception of itself? Are we still the invincible, unbeatable nation that won World War II and had all the nuclear weapons? Or is this war conflict going to basically affect that perception? You can probably already figure out the answer, but think about that a little bit as you continue discussing the Cold War. So again, in the meantime, think about how we should deal with the complex issues of Vietnam now, and how exactly we should remember the Vietnam War. We'll come back to this again a little bit on the next lesson. Excuse me, but in the meantime, that's all I really have for you right now. Just remember these upcoming assignments, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.